Okay. Smart mobility I put for all. Of course, I'm asking if it is for women and men in the same way. And the aim of my talk is to get deeper into this issue of gender and smart mobility. Where is the connection? What relationship do we see between this intention, this idea of smart mobility and gender? And I will make 4 steps in my presentation. I will start with asking, what do we know about gender-specific use of new mobility concepts and digitized mobility services, which are part of the smart mobility concept? I'm asking, what should we know? And when I found out what, from my perspective, we should know, I will come to the consequences for future research, and finally I will give some recommendations. That I put myself to this issue was also against the background that we find here and there some figures about women, in particular about women and men, using these new services and these new options of smart mobility, and every time we see that women are using them much less than men do. And I'm wondering why there is not very much research at the moment on this issue. Well, let me just briefly start with the idea of smart mobility. Those who have already been in Berlin may see that this is some kind of smart mobility vision for Berlin. And smart mobility is part of what some people call a winning urban strategy. A winning urban strategy using technology to increase the quality of life in urban space, both improving the environmental quality and delivering better services to the citizens. This means energy efficiency in the transport sector, low emission levels, safety and comfort, and affordability. And again, digitization is an important instrument to create an integrated transport system for this smart mobility concept. And this integrated system would allow for lots of mobility options, motorized as well as non-motorized. For the user, this means that digitization provides easier access to information about travel routes and times, schedules and stops, costs and fares. And I suppose many of you have this kind of applications on their smartphones. This makes mobility easier. It makes you more flexible in your everyday travel. And particularly well known are the so-called sharing concepts with car and bike sharing or ride sharing. They may exist as standalone operation or in combination with other modes, in particular with public transport. In Germany, for instance, Deutsche Bahn, the railway operator in Germany, is experimenting with a combination of public transport and ride sharing. Local city operators also do it, for instance, in Berlin. And this goes hand in hand with digitized services for navigation and information that are broadly available for public transport, but also for car use. And the interesting thing, and this sticks up a little bit to the discussion you just had on this technological direction that also the Commission is taking when funding projects, that there is a high belief in the positive impact of these technology-driven concepts, and these concepts are expected to do something that we haven't seen in the past so very much, which is changing mobility behavior of people. Let me briefly show what I'm talking of when it is about new mobility concepts and digitized services. And let me start with car sharing concepts. Many of you will know the car sharing concepts, very traditional ones, car sharing as station-based systems, or the new version of car sharing is these flexible, so-called free-floating systems. In the station-based car sharing originally developed as an idea for being more sustainable. It developed as an association of people who had not the same lifestyle, but the same thoughts about the world and how it should be in mind. Today it has very much become a commercial services, and free-floating car sharing is almost fully a commercial service. In any case, what you need to get access to these services is you need a credit card, so you need financial resources, you need a smartphone to be able to locate the car and to open the car, and of course you need a driving license. And what is interesting too for these systems, car sharing, in particular free-floating car sharing, is restricted to a specific area in the city where you have high densities, not necessarily of population, but of working people. So there is a restriction. If you look at the very, very few studies that give some information about gender-specific use of car sharing, then you see that the users of car sharing, of station-based car sharing, are more men than women. It's about 60% men and 40% women, and we find this all across Europe. There are studies from Brussels, from London, from the Netherlands, from Germany, and they all come to approximately the same figures. I know some papers from the US, in particular from San Francisco Bay Area, where it is said that there is almost no gender difference in the use of car sharing. But this is Europe. And for free-floating car sharing, the difference is even larger. You have about 70% of men and 30% of women. And these men, they are young, they are in the age group up to 35 years. They are living in small households, 1 to 2 persons. They have above average formal education, and they have above average income. When we look at another new mobility option, which is ride sharing, then we see and we are told that this is a rapidly increasing market. By the way, Uber reports about 500 million rides worldwide per year. The public transport operator in Berlin, he has doubled the number only in one city. So should be careful when thinking that this is the big thing to come up. But well, this is just aside, as this is my transport researcher hat. This idea of ride sharing, so I go from A to B and I take someone with me who has approximately the same start of his or her trip and the same end of his or her trip, is nothing really new. It is something quite old, because we were used to it, to do it with our families, with our friends, with our colleagues. But what we see now is commercialization of ride sharing, and companies like Uber and Lyft. In the US, they are no longer called ride-sharing systems, but ride-hailing systems, to make clear this is a commercial thing. In contrast to the car sharing, we see many micro-operators for the ride-sharing services. This means that they are not bound to delimited areas, so that they can also serve areas with lower densities. But again, the access to the system is only possible via credit card and via smartphone. And finally, we have these, gendered use. There is no really gendered use reported for Uber, but the figures that you see here, 52% women, 48% men, this is worldwide. While we see a clearly gendered use for the US, because Lyft is only operating in the US. So obviously there is something that we cannot really, argue about, but obviously there are some differences if you have worldwide or just US figures. But this is everything, all I found. I didn't find anything else about these ride-sharing services and the gendered use of them. Well, finally, there are these digitized services which make also part of the smart mobility concept. And they are operating in particular for public transport, either to improve the existing services in public transport or to enhance them with new mobility options. Important improvements in the existing services relate to the information about public transport services. Information in that case has not only become much more comprehensive and reliable, but also mobile and dynamic. In addition, ticketing is available online and in mobile form, but this particular application, however, also requires a valid credit card and a mobile phone, or better, a smartphone. If I summarize these few findings that we have about gender differences in the use of new mobility concepts and digitized services, I would keep the following. The use of these options and services shows gender gaps, but these gender gaps do not appear equally across these services. Rather, there are clear differences depending on the kind of service. And when I saw these figures, I made several assumptions concerning the underlying reasons. First assumption was the acceptance of technology-based services differs between gender. The services fit in unequal ways for women and men. And third assumption, the resources to use services are dissimilar between women and men. And starting from these assumptions, I went through research literature which addresses comparable issues in other fields. The literature review I made concerned research about the acceptance and use of new technologies, gender-specific travel patterns, and gender-specific access to mobility and ICT resources. And in the following, I will briefly discuss the evidences reported in the literature, and on this basis, I will then suggest research needs and directions for smart mobility where it is used, where it is linked to the use of digital advices. When I get into the acceptance topic, then all of you or most of you will know the first or the starting point, which was the technology acceptance model of Davies from the 1980s. And this model was developed as a theoretical basis for studying acceptance, with the general proposition that user acceptance of new technologies was determined by two key beliefs, which were perceived ease of use and perceived usefulness. They acted on attitudes towards the usage, and this led to intentions of use. There is a huge debate, there followed up a huge debate about this model, about refinements, about improvements. I recommend an article from Long Lee from the year 2010, which is very, very helpful to go into this issue. There are two extensions where I want to draw your attention. Two extensions. One extension was made by Venkatesh and Morris. They introduced as an additional factor acting on the intention to use the subjective norm. And this subjective norm made, to be honest, I do not know, explicitly or implicitly allow for looking at gender aspects in the acceptance of new technologies. Because then it started that you had at least some studies about this gender aspect for technology use. And a second improvement or enhancement was made by Thompson by introducing compatibility. What he wanted to say by this is when a new innovation comes up, it has to be compatible with what is already existing. That means it has to fit into what you are already experiences, into your habits, into your routines, into the way that you are leading. When Venkatesh and Morris introduced this subjective norm, they also made several studies. One about the reactions and usage behavior among knowledge workers who were introduced to a new software system. They found significant differences between men and women concerning the factors influencing usage of a new technology. While men were more driven by instrumental factors, which is the perceived usefulness, women were more motivated by the process, which is the perceived ease of use, and also by social factors, which is the subjective norm. In a more qualitative interpretation, the authors suggested that men are more focused in their decision-making regarding new technologies, while women are more balanced in their decision-making process. In other words, they say, while men only consider productivity-related factors, women consider inputs from a number of sources, including productivity assessments, when making technology adoption and usage decisions. So what is really interesting is not necessarily the use itself, but how they come to use a new technology, what motivates them to use the new technology. When it comes to perceived compatibility, it is about existing values, beliefs, and experiences. And I think this is a particular contribution, as existing values, beliefs, experience are relevant factors that consider also the environment and the context in which an innovation falls. Well, against this background, the innovation does not only need to meet perceived usefulness and ease of use for the future, but must allow for this integration, and I think this is a very important aspect of all these new things that we expect in the framework of smart mobility. Most of the more recent studies on technology acceptance that took into account gender differences concerned job environment issues. This has always to be kept in mind. This is all job environment. For this specific context, these studies come to corresponding results, but we have very little evidence from other fields, in particular from the field of mobility and transport, if those differences also hold there. Travel patterns. Randy Yortol, she once had made a distinction of travel patterns coming from the wish for travel, the possibility to travel, and the obligation to travel. And with this framework, she did quite a lot of research, as many other researchers did, on the particular field of social relations and their influence the influence that gender-specific division of labor inside and outside of home wields on daily travel patterns. These studies showed consistently that activity and travel patterns of women are largely affected by the complex time-space constraints on travel experienced by those who have double responsibility for domestic work and employment. Expectations that ongoing societal developments like professional occupation should have induced significant changes were not fulfilled. In the best case, imbalances were mitigated, but they were not eliminated. For the case of work trips in Norway in the years 1992 and 2005, Randy Yortol observed that difference between the genders persisted, but it was smaller than in 1992. With the National Travel Survey in Germany of 2008, we found similar developments. Fully employed women have shorter trips to work than fully employed men, also when they do not have children. You can see this here, women with children, without children, men with children, without children. And if you compare the blue Balken? What do you? Bar. The blue bar, thank you. The blue bar, you see, it is shorter for women. It is also, it's much more shorter for women who have 2 children compared to the one for men with 2 children. And what you also can see, this bar, or this distance finally, becomes much shorter if there is more than 1 child in the household, while for men it does not make too much difference if they have 1 or 2 children. So this persists, and the distance between home and workplace decreases for both, but for women much more than for men. These findings were underpinned by studies of rather slow changes in regard of division of domestic responsibilities, participation in earned labor and earned income. Apparently, this applies across Europe. Even though recent studies in several European countries showed that traditional forms of division of labor constitute an exception in early phases of partnership, they also concluded that traditional forms were dominating in its later phases. Egalitarian arrangements for division of non-work labor as well as egalitarian attitudes to gender-specific division of labor were found above all among couples without children. And very much linked to this is the need to escort other people, and I will skip this because I have already the 10-minute sign, because it is something very well known across the literature. It is interesting, nevertheless, in the context of new mobility concepts and of new digitized services for mobility as part of the smart mobility approach. Because if you consider that escorting can mean bringing someone somewhere, but escorting can also mean doing something and being accompanied by someone, because you cannot leave your 3-year-old children at home while you're going for shopping or while you're making other errands. And in mobility research, we have almost no information if someone is going out alone or if he or she is accompanied by another person, and which kind of person. So, and finally, let me come to the mobility resources. I didn't find a similar picture for Norway or maybe for Europe, but what we can see across Europe is that the access to mobility resources shows quite fast changes, and they are all about this picture, which is for Germany. And what you can see is the following. We have these people 75 and older, and the level of possession of driving license for women is still very low. In 2002, it becomes higher in 2008. The same for men, but compared to women, their level of driving license possession is still rather high. If you look at the younger people, then you see there is no longer any difference from the 18-year-old up to the 30-year-old. There is no difference between men and women, and once this graph shifts to the right side, we will no longer see differences in this kind of access to mobility resources. And we see also a change in regard to car ownership. At least for Germany, we see that about 1/3 of women have their own car today, really their own car, not only access to a car, but still this is much lower than the access to cars that men have. And finally, the gender-specific resources when it comes to communication devices. We do not see any difference by the figures that we have either for the US or for Europe between the access to communication devices between women and men. We have made recently a study in Germany, and we found that the access to mobile devices for women is even a bit higher than it is for men. We cannot explain it, we just see it. From this, I would like to suggest the following fields and concerns of future research. And the idea of what I prepared for today was not to find answers, but to stimulate research that should make us understand the motivations and reasons that lead to the observed behaviors and help designing new mobility concepts and services in a way that makes them useful for men and women. Likewise, Tim, unfortunately I couldn't listen to your presentation, but there is something going on meanwhile for the question of women, in particular women, and automation. What does it mean in particular for mobility? And I think also this links very much to this issue of automation or this kind of digitization, because automation will require the same resources and the same mechanisms of access as we see them already today for this kind of services. So, first suggestion, I think we should have much more studies on the acceptance and use of new technologies, because there are different approaches, at least in some fields, as we have seen on the side of women and on the side of men. And coming from these insights, I would assume subsequently that new technology-based mobility options and services are also differently considered from women and men. And one assumption could be, and there is very little literature out on that, that men rather quickly integrate them in their mobility behavior with a decisive goal to optimize their movement. This idea of optimization as a masculine idea. Women may be more concerned with perceived ease of use and the integration of these new options into their everyday mobility practices. Second topic that I would like to recommend is again on activity and travel patterns. And I would like to see more research on the places where female activities happen. Because all these new mobility services, these new mobility options that we have, they are, I hope I could show this before, they are restricted to very specific places. And we have a long debate, at least in transport geography, about gendered places. And I think this is a new form of gendering places, because you make services available for particular places. And the question is, who is there? And the second background why I would like to see more studies on activity and travel patterns of women and men is the question how, which are the activities that are carried out. Again, this issue, not only which are the activities. Today we have a list of work, shop, leisure, and so on. But we should have a closer look at how these activities are carried out. Who has to be accompanied, or who is in company of the person who does something. And I think this is also a point that we haven't explored so far. And obviously there is no gender gap in the specific access to communication devices. It is getting smaller with regard to mobility resources. But okay, I have to, I try to make it shorter, but it's not that easy. So okay, this prompts the conclusion that it's not the instrumental capabilities that make the gap between women and men in the use of new mobility options and digitized services. Rather, it might be other resources that are behind, like monetary mobility budgets, availability of credit cards, other basic access authorization lacks. So I think future research should also include these aspects, although they are not directly mobility. I will end by some recommendations. Implementing smart mobility as a strategy that includes all citizens, irrespective of gender, requires a lot more analytical research about gender-specific motivations and decision-making. This will help us to understand the aspects that foster or hinder the implementation. On the one side, I would say it's an academic interest to be able to explain what is going on, but this interest is relevant for the society, and it's also relevant for the implementation itself. And we could make really good advice from our academic fields how smart mobility should look and how it could implement it. And I would like much more than I could find in my literature review, qualitative approaches. I think in particular in transport research, we are very much on the quantitative side, which helps us not at some points to very well understand what is going on, but at many points we have not really understood why there are these gender differences and how they can be solved. And finally, I would also wish for research to understand the effect of optimization. I'm living in a world of engineers. DLR is completely engineer. Transportation research, completely, except for Tim, completely engineer. And this optimization, this is something like a Zauberwort? A miracle. Yeah, it's something like that. It's the miracle word. And this optimization, women are also impacted by this optimization. And this brings me to my final remark, that I would really also like to understand what optimization means from a gender perspective. What is the impact on individual well-being coming along with optimization? And what does it mean in view of already and still existing and potential new gender inequalities? And when I say this, I have in mind the lessons that we have learned many years ago from Ruth Cowan in her book titled More Work for Mother, The Ironies of Household Technology from the Open Hearth to the Microwave. Hopefully, smart mobility will not only be mobility for all, but provide indeed mobility options that do not only satisfy our needs and wishes, but contribute to the happiness of all. Thank you.